Hey guys, welcome to Making the Rounds. It's been a while. Emily and I wanted to do some specific or some very interesting episodes that are different from the kind of stuff we normally do, which is talking about the games and the teams and stuff. Because during the course of Worlds and stuff that happened between and before and everything else, there have been a few controversies related to esports journalism or esports content creation or just general third-party other things that are comparing esports directly to sports and the way this is set up. And I thought that Emily is a good person to talk about this because she has some experience in the sports journalism world. So I kind of wanted to get her take on it and then also just talk about some specifics of the esports versus the sports industry that people might not be aware of when they make like straight one-to-one comparisons. So, for the first one, what we're going to talk about is just esports journalism and then kind of the evolution. And what motivated this episode was like the Immortals controversy during World's Group Stage. If you guys can rewind your mind all the way back to that moment long ago when Travis made the joke tweet that wasn't even about being denied interviews, and everyone was like, "Why the Immortals denying interviews? I don't understand. This is not fair. We paid money to send people there." I don't know. It's an unfair characterization of what happened. I apologize to my colleagues. Anyway, to start off, let's just talk a little bit about Emily, who's going to be our spiritual guide through the experience of disentangling sports and esports journalism. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of where you have your background in sports journalism and where your qualifications come from?
Yeah, so I studied it way back when I was in college. I'm super old, so this is like early 2000s, and then I worked for a short time with the newspaper in Burlington, Vermont, which is near where my college was. I assume this is part of any like traditional journalism degree. But basically, in my program, you started off, you did like basic writing, then you were a staff writer on one of the two newspapers that we had, one print and one online. And then after that, you were an editor, so you could experience both sides of the equation. And then we had to do what they called like a practicum, which was like you basically had to do this giant project, which is like a large feature or a feature video on some sort of news thing that you liked or wanted to focus on, etc. So that is kind of the overview. And then I also wrote about sports in Vermont, which is not as traditional as people would say, because obviously no major sports teams. Vermont is tiny. They do have a single A baseball team called the Lake Monsters, which is actually really fun to cover them. But then it's a lot of, so I think maybe people don't realize a lot of papers, especially ones that are smaller like this, you end up doing a lot of statistical work. You're waiting for like high schools to call in about their swim meets. And then I did a lot of outdoor stuff too. So a little bit out of the structure of traditional sports like football, hockey, baseball, that kind of stuff, but also like cycling and hiking. And I got to go to a regatta one time on Lake Champlain. That was awesome. So I guess that's kind of, yeah.
See, one of the things I like about Emily is she could have had this opportunity to really big up like her history and what her work background was, and then just use a lot of vague words. I'm not calling out anyone specific in the esports scene because that would take way too long. But yes, anyway, moving on to the next topic.
Hey, the regatta was cool. That was awesome. I got to spend 2 days on a boat watching people sail. It was actually super cool. It's like the best traditional sports. It's not even traditional sports, I guess, but that's the best sporting assignment I ever had. It was amazing. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm not meaning to belittle your experience, but you could have been like, I went to a very, very impressive college, and like there were 300 people in my journalism class, and only one of them graduated, and that was me. And then a bunch of other bullshit talking about like how you came from nothing, and you had to eat the shoes in your closet in order to survive and pay for your journalism dream. and then just like really big up the sailing event and be like, people came from all over the world. I'm just saying. No, I think that it's still like valuable information because there are so many people in the scene who are not really as talking about sports journalism out their ass, right? And that's basically me, which is like I have no idea how it normally works, or I don't have any experience whatsoever, and people are just like constantly like making one-to-one comparisons. So any insight that we get on this topic from people in the scene who have kind of done both roles, I think is valuable. So with that in mind, I kind of want to talk a little bit about some of the differences and some of the similarities in esports and sports journalism, and where we can kind of make some valid comparisons. So one of the things is that based on the research that I've done and the information about sports journalism that I have is that both of these kind of disciplines evolved almost in a joint or a connected way with the esports scenes themselves and the sports scenes themselves, where there was like a much closer relationship initially when League of Legends esports, which is what I can talk about most easily, and the coverage of this came more hand in hand. It was like people would write articles, and sometimes when the coaching scene was developing, like these were the types of people that teams would go to for just like any kind of advice. And then there was a lot more closeness, like Travis Gafford has experienced situations where he's able to just go backstage from the dawn of time and just be in the player rooms and like hang out with the players, and this is how he did a lot of his early content, and there weren't a lot of competitors. I think that that's similar to the sports history, or at least from my understanding is like how it started out is you would have sports journalists, especially in baseball, like really involved in some of the scorekeeping thing, and this would really dictate like what players were valued and picked by coaches, and there would be a lot of back and forth between sports and commentary, and it eventually separated for reasons to deal with conflict of interest and things like that. Does that sound reasonable to you based on like the research that you've done?
And I mean that kind of, so one thing that I guess the first thing you learn is that like you're striving to be objective, right? And this is something that happened in traditional journalism too, where you go through peaks and valleys of people trying to distance themselves from the subject because they were brought up alongside it. So I think that's a fair assessment.
Also, just in general, so what can we take from this, I guess, is just that the distance that has increased over time with sports and esports journalism.
I mean, I think, so I know we're going to talk about this in a bit, but like I think another thing that is interesting and unique to esports journalism is that I feel like a lot of people look at sports journalism, which usually came up alongside the sport, just out of people who were hobbyists or really interested in what was going on in a similar way. But then because they see that traditional sports journalism already has that separation, already has the infrastructure and organization, they're just like, oh, we need to be like this, so we're just going to take that model and kind of bring it over and set it up from the top down. And you can kind of see this happening as esports evolved, as non-endemic but traditional sports organizations got involved in writing about esports. Obviously, some of them still kind of write some wonky articles, but then you also have people like ESPN entering and writing about it. The Score, who was the first to also enter the space writing about esports, and they both use that kind of like what they have as existing structure in place to go and then write about esports. And that kind of forced a bit more separation.
What I thought was one of the more interesting things is that as the sports side or the sports aspect became more interesting and it became part of the newspaper organizations, like as we've seen with esports over time, is that you have other established reporting industries, usually sports-based ones, right, come into the scene and add an esports division. They just bring in a lot of the same people who have been hobbyists, who have been reporting on esports, but my understanding is that when sports reporting became bigger and bigger and some of these news agencies came in, they just installed like some of their best reporters to go cover the Olympics or to go cover horse racing or something of that nature that was already... They didn't necessarily take the hobbyists at that time, and it was just already like a very respected kind of field. But
Yeah, I'd say they probably lean. I like generally from what I remember, and again, this is a while ago because I'm super old. But they took like you tend to take your best writer. That's actually something I'm looking out for going forward as more traditional sports outlets start looking at esports and maybe start writing about it. Especially with the franchising that's coming to North America. I'm curious to see whether some of these traditional like news publications will send either someone from the sports division or someone from entertainment that's already an established writer to go write about it. Because like my first experience with esports in traditional journalism was actually in, when was the Link like Dunzo manifesto? That was 2013, 2014?
Mm-hmm.
It was a while ago. Anyway, my dad knew that I loved League of Legends. And so one time when I was home visiting my parents, he handed me like the back page of the Boston Globe sports section. And there was like an entire article about like former League of Legends player burns his team on his way out. Like, I was just like, oh, I didn't realize we'd come this far. So like, and in that case, anyway, so it was a hilarious story for me because I was like, what is this? But they just assigned someone who's already a writer there to go and cover this.
I think, again, one of the more interesting and unique things about esports is that because it started as like almost a counterculture thing, and I'm not saying that sports was necessarily completely different, because at least in sports reporting, it was almost like the toy division. I think people have called that when sports reporting first started being a thing. But now it's, people at least like were very familiar with the idea of sport, and sport had always been part of culture. But for esports, I guess it's kind of, esports itself is sort of looked down on very heavily. So it's also very obscure kind of situational world that isn't already public, or I guess it's public, but it's not like in the limelight. So you need some of these hobbyists with more specialized knowledge to do good work, whereas I felt like that was less the case with sports. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I'd agree. I was actually talking to Tim from Cyber Esports, I believe, at All Stars, and we were just talking about how people perceive esports in general, and he basically made the point, he's like, I don't understand why, and like I don't he wasn't meaning to like crap on dressage, which is a very traditional English style of horseback riding. Like if you see it, it's very weird. It's kind of cool. I don't know, I've watched it before. But he was like, I don't see why we can look at something like that and be like, oh, this isn't weird or whatever. It's just, you know, under sports. And then look at esports and say, oh, this is weird, and people playing video games in their basement and stuff like that. So I think that has a bit to do with, I guess, stigma around video games. And then additionally, the decision to call it esports in the first place, because the fact that the language, so the English language word, is already comparing it to traditional sports by virtue of the name itself, that automatically invites comparison.
Yep, I think that's fair. That's a separate topic as to whether or not esports should be sports, but
oh yeah, I didn't even get involved in that.
It's true. But I think it's worth noting that the need for specialized knowledge is more apparent in esports journalism than it is in sports journalism, because it's less easily accessible to get that specialized knowledge. In terms of like the structure of the industry and the deadlines, I think are very similar. You have games every weekend or whatever, and you have games taking place late at night, and sometimes you have to get stories out the next morning. So this type of time crunch, this like no life sort of reporting work, or keeping up to date on everything, where you're immediately watching games at 3 a.m. if you're covering China, Korea, or whatever, and then starting to write some sort of article, and then you go to bed at 10 a.m., you sleep for a couple of hours, get up and watch North America or something. But
my schedule.
Yeah. So I think that's the type of, that's also consistent with like how a lot of sports stuff is run, and it's also very unique to from other types of reporting, where obviously you will have like big stories and times where you're really, really hitting the grindstone on the hours and trying to get an investigative report out, or trying to follow like a big campaign or something like this, but it's not necessarily as all the time as sports is, just because the time crunch and things of that nature. So I think that's worth noting as well.
Even when I was so again, like Vermont, not necessarily what you think of when you think of like traditional sports orgs, but even then, like my office hours were, oh my God, I'm trying to think, from like 10 to 7 or something like that. But I found myself doing so much more work off the clock just because, like, you know, a cyclist can't get back to me until she's done doing this, or like I have to cover an event for 2 days where I'm out on the boat and then I have to come immediately back and write the entire piece that night until whenever I finish, and then just submit it. Like your time with sports, and again, I haven't done any sort of investigative, like general news reporting, so someone can totally call me out on this if they have had experience and they think this is incorrect. But your time really isn't your own. You're constantly waiting for people to get back to you, and it's also structured around all the events, especially if you are doing sports in kind of a place like Vermont where you're not necessarily covering stuff that is even as regularly scheduled as like baseball or football every Sunday or something like that. So
sure, I think that has a lot to do with like the kind of information that gets posted, or that's little elements of esports or sports journalism that seem weirdly unprofessional because they're rushed at times. So obviously that's more of a problem in esports journalism because of the nature of the industry being very young and everything else, but I think it's also something that will play into continuous topics that we're discussing. But obviously the major difference is how much more behind right now esports journalism is from sports journalism. I would say that sports journalism at this point is a much more established institution. You have publications that have been able to be successful just by covering sports, which has really not happened with esports. You have all sorts of, obviously the climate right now for media in general is kind of negative, but so sports media industry has issues as well. But obviously, like the nature of esports requiring specialized knowledge as it evolves, of the hours and of the schedule and everything else, of like the kind of people who are attracted to esports journalism as opposed to other types of journalism, I think make it kind of very scattered. And you have a lot of people who are throwing money into it, and these types of organizations will shut down their esports division. Obviously, I've never experienced that multiple times in my career, but there's just a lot of flux and a lot of lack of development, even in how media and team relations advance. And there are a lot of issues with media versus team relations that sports kind of went through that we could theoretically draw from, but not everything, I think, is the same. And the way that the evolution of sports and esports journalism has, like, already we're talking about even in the similarities, ways that it's diverging. So in developing the infrastructure of esports journalism, what are some of the issues that you think come to mind the most?
So from, like, if we're going to jump into kind of the Immortals, like, joke topic next, which I know Travis didn't even mean for it to blow up as big as it did. But I think one thing from the player side is that, like, if you are, say, a top football prospect, right, and you're going through high school, you're already going to start getting interviewed by people. Again, when you go to, like, when you start interviewing for colleges, when you are playing at a top level in a college football program, you're going to be going through a ton of media training. It doesn't always work, but, like, on the whole, I'd say players in traditional sports, they grow up, and as they go through high school, college, or high school and some sort of, like, minor league program, they have a lot more defined idea of how the media relationship is going to work, just because it's already been established for years and years and years. And obviously, initially, this wasn't a thing, and there was general confusion in terms of how they were supposed to relate. But as we are right now, I feel like traditional sports, there's already an understanding in place where people go through media training immediately, or they just get used to it from a young-ish age. And I think even though esports players that I deal with are about the same age, they don't have the same understanding or expectation of what the media relationship is supposed to be, which isn't even necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it can lead to like really candid, awesome interviews. Like I joked around with the scouting grounds players I followed, but like it's awesome to be around guys like that because they don't have any media training and they're just kind of like really open and fun, and you get a lot of amazing candid content out of that. But so I think that's one thing where just in general, like in terms of the entire esports machine, players don't come to the table as prepared to talk to media. And unless they like make a purpose of studying it, which oddly enough, like to bring up an odd example, Mike Young did. Like he came to the table and he was like, oh yeah, I'm like ready. And he did these like very strong interviews right off the bat. I was pretty surprised. But then you also have the idea of sending reporters in who may not know how to, and I know even some of the Riot broadcasters have brought this up, how to deal with like really overly emotional moments. Players have not been prepared to speak in that manner after like a really crushing loss. And then also people who are covering esports, because they might be hobbyists, because they just lack experience. Like I don't think having a degree necessarily gives you a leg up, but what it does do is provide more experience to talk to people, right? In kind of those awkward and like super emotionally charged situations. And in traditional sports, there are a lot of them. And obviously in esports, there are a lot of them. And so you have to be prepared to kind of lead that interview. Otherwise, you end up with something that is a mess. And there are several examples I could point to in esports history where it was just awkward or weird because the player didn't seem like they wanted to be there because they're really upset, understandably so, about a loss, and the interviewer doesn't necessarily know how to handle that. And so I think a good example that I'd want to point out is how when TSM lost at Worlds, Reggie did an interview with Travis immediately after, because I do think there should be some commentary coming out, right? Like there should be an expectation that someone from the team is going to talk about this. This is a huge thing. They're expected to make it out of groups. And Reggie steps up and he's like, gives this very candid interview, and Travis is prepared to do it. And maybe that's because of their pre-existing relationship, like we talked about, how Travis was kind of in the esports scene right beside the teams as they were coming up. But I think that is kind of what I would have wanted out of some of these situations, or like kind of what needs to happen going forward, is that both sides need to understand that they're like reporters are going to want some sort of commentary or content coming out of a big event. And then on the flip side, interviewees should be prepared for that. And I'm not saying that like Noah should have shoved Cody Sun out to do an interview, because that's awful. And like, that's not setting him up for success. And he's probably not prepared to do that. But you know, I like the idea of someone coming forward and interviewing and providing a perspective on a team, much like you would have a traditional press conference with like a losing coach or a losing player.
Just to clarify, because we didn't exactly outline the Immortal situation, what happened was that Immortals didn't make it out of group stage at Worlds, if people remember, and then within moments of the Nexus crashing, I think the Nexus wasn't even dead yet, and the press manager, or the press liaison, I guess, in the press room, turned to everyone and said, Immortals have declined all interviews. And Travis tweeted about this, mostly because he thought it was appropriate to the situation because of how disappointing the Immortals results were, not necessarily because he was criticizing them. But obviously other members of the community, the esports media communities, talked about how this is really, like, we can't really accept this, that this is not a good standard to have. So as you said, you talked specifically about player experience and player understanding of media. The media training that Riot even give players is really interesting. So I have sort of my own anecdote where there were 2 qualifiers before promotion tournament, right? There were 2 best of 5 qualifiers. One was Giants versus Wind and Rain, and the other one was Schalke versus Red Bull. And then, excuse me, I can't say Red Bull, I have to say RB. But I wasn't allowed to go to the first one because the players hadn't had media training, but I was allowed to go to the second one because Schalke were independently inviting press, right? So they said, in that case, we may as well just let you in. Like, if they're fine with their players talking to press with no media training, then it's whatever. But through that experience, I kind of learned a lot about what the Riot media training is, and what it is it's basically just they're talking about how to teach players to not answer questions that they don't have the answers to, right? It's effectively the focus of the media training. So the example that was given was, say in LJL, some team wins with Teemo jungle, right? And they ask, so incidentally, like a press person comes up and asks a player after a game, what do you think as a jungler of the Teemo jungle pick that was an LJL? And the player most likely hasn't watched LJL, but how do you navigate that situation without being disrespectful to the LJL and then also not making stuff up and not having thoughts like, oh, well, Teemo would probably do this with this type of build and just do theoretical things, and that's like completely different from what happened in the game, and then get called out for being dishonest. So I think it's kind of like a weird example that they gave, but overall, it's just really simple common sense type things. So people would say, okay, is media training even necessary then? Like, is the media training that's given to the players adequate? I think that's really the big question, is like, the understanding of the type of media training that these players have is really, really minimal. It's like they might have a half day of media training at most that Riot goes in and does for them. Teams themselves probably aren't investing a lot into doing that. That, again, might change over time. But in Europe, for sure, people haven't really invested a lot into teaching their players to be on camera. Very few players care about it that much, except for players like Maxler, maybe, who are really focused on brand building and streaming and constantly interacting with his fan base. And so it's really, really minimal. I think you kind of get the slow ramp up, and this is the same with discussing traditional sports and esports in terms of players that are immediately thrust into the spotlight because they're good at playing solo queue. That would kind of be like, oh, I've been kicking around my soccer ball with some kids in the back park, and then suddenly, I'm on a national team. No. So yeah,
that'd be amazing. That'd be an amazing story.
That's effectively what happens in esports, right? Though, because you get top 2 rank on NA solo queue, and then they put you in-house. I think that there's definitely a big gap here, and so people who are having like the same expectations of esports players as sports players are being a little unkind. At the same token, I think a lot of the journalists and a lot of the media coverage people aren't introspective enough to realize that the same is true on the other end, right? You mentioned this very briefly, is that there are a lot of journalists who are, and we talked about this earlier, there are a lot of journalists who are hobbyists in the scene, who don't necessarily have that much experience, but are doing it because it's fun, and they do it on a side job, and there might be an event in their city that they can go to, and they can get someone to sponsor them from, like, a gaming outlet, like the Chopsky TV is the new one. There's a new one, I feel like, every month or something. But they end up going to these the esports events and doing their first interviews with LCS players or whatever, and they aren't necessarily able to form a coherent sentence. I have never been good at talking, so you can imagine that I'm being self-aware at this moment. And then you get really bizarre questions. Like this is actually a very big problem with Chinese media right now, is that so much money just rushed into building up these, just like everything else in China, there was a very serious issue with money being thrown everywhere. So there were a bunch of media companies that got propped up unrealistically for a while. So you had people coming from who were effectively like fangirls who were interested in dating the players like in the press room because they could get media jobs, right? And then you had these really awkward questions coming up about like girlfriends and things like this that eventually, because of the sheer volume of press and everything else, Riot China restricted it to press conferences, and you had to have your questions pre-approved, and everything else that became really unsustainable just because teams were uncomfortable with some of the media questions that were being put out. And you can say, okay, that's unreasonable, but there's like a fine line. There's a difference between the questions that are being asked by professional sports reporters and some of the questions being asked by really inexperienced, like zero barrier of entry esports interviewers. And I don't necessarily think that we should require esports reporters to have journalism degrees or to have extensive experience doing writing or some other type of esports work before they do an interview, but I think that we have to be mindful of that. So if teams don't want to necessarily open up interviews to everyone, they need to be able to have like this kind of selectiveness, and because both sides need to develop. Both sides need to get good at this give and take. It's not like a one-way street where, oh, how dare these teams not do press interviews? And I don't know. I think that that's something that often gets overlooked when people talk about the unfairness of teams in terms of interacting with media.
Yeah, I think, so again, like, I'm probably going to sound like a broken record by the end of this, but I think just so much of it comes from experience. Like, I was absolutely shit when I started. Like, I'd studied, but I was shit. Like, my questions are terrible. Like, I was super awkward. And you just have to do it more, you know? Mm-hmm. Like, it just, a lot of it, like, sure, you'll learn, like, how to ask open-ended questions and how to, you know, sit down and have a conversation. But, like, my first interviews were so bad. Like, I think back and I'm just like, God, how did these players even talk to me? Like, why? And now it's just a lot more of sitting down and having a conversation with someone because I will have interviewed them before, or I just feel a lot more comfortable because maybe I haven't met them in person. But, like, for example, I interviewed for an article to come out before the start of the CBL season. I interviewed Dave at All Stars. It's the first time I've met him, but because I followed his career and because I have more experience as an interviewer, and also because he is a little bit older than some of his peers and he carries himself very well, he's very well spoken, we sat down and we had just what I thought was a great conversation that ended up being a really good interview. But it just takes time. It just takes time. It takes experience. Sometimes it just takes, like, getting older and maturing as a person, which isn't anything I think people want to hear. Like, I wouldn't have wanted to hear it when I was a lot younger. But yeah, it just, like, that's the thing that the esports industry needs, is just time. Like, even if you're taking this infrastructure from traditional sports and you're saying this is how it should be, it's just not going to get there. Just like teaching someone in journalism school how to do something, it's not going to turn into anything awesome until they actually have more experience doing it.
I also think it's fair to say that we're at a point where the industry has developed enough that it's okay to have certain requirements of losing teams in high-pressure situations, as you already outlined, but I don't think that those should be do an interview with every single sports outlet. I don't think those should be have the players do the interviews. I think that we've gotten to the point where there are good enough journalists that someone can be able to do content. Travis is at pretty much every international event, every North American event. He has good relationships with most teams. I have pretty decent relationships with a variety of teams. Emily does. So there are people in the scene who aren't just me or aren't just Emily also, but just who, like, there are a bunch of Korean reporters who are regulars. There's a very good guy named Brian Liwei. There are a couple of really strong outlets in China, like Tuan. I'm not shitting on all of Chinese media. I actually think it's unfortunate that there's such a mixed bag of Chinese media because it reflects poorly on a bunch of people who are doing really good work. And so I think that there's enough development at this point that there should be some kind of requirement. But I think it's unreasonable to get really pissed off at Immortals, because Immortals especially has been had been a very good organization with media in League of Legends over time in general, and really understood that branding aspect. So if there's one situation, and yeah, it's a high pressure, newsworthy situation, explodes and there's no interviews, then that's fine. You can still do content.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to bring up the Reggie Travis interview, because I thought that was so on one day, and again, I feel bad for bringing it up sometimes. I know Travis didn't mean for his joke tweet to turn into this huge discussion about journalism, but one day we had that example, and then two days later, one day later, I don't know, everything blends together. We had a really great example of Reggie stepping up and speaking on behalf of TSM, and I think in that kind of situation, that's really the perfect example of what can happen. Or I guess in traditional sports, you'd have a press conference with the losing coach or a losing managers or a losing veteran player who is a little bit more comfortable speaking in these situations. I also would, as a side note, like to remind people that not all losers press conferences in traditional sports are good either. Sometimes interviewing, so there's typically a press conference, right? And sometimes interviewing those coaches and those players, it's pulling teeth. So it's still not I feel like people sometimes in esports have this, because there's that infrastructure in place, they look at it and they're everything is golden over there. And it's no, when someone suffers a crushing defeat, they still might give a super awkward press conference, even in traditional sports, even if they're trained. It happens.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point to point out. And since we've kind of hammered the interview relationship a lot, and you have some unique ideas on this and how it has worked, let's talk about some other stuff that is behind, perhaps, or that are unique challenges to esports journalism. I think one thing in particular is the way that the editor infrastructure is done in esports journalism is a bit more unique, because generally, again, these are passion project people, or they're people who have been in other sides as editors for other sides of journalism, and then they come in and they're suddenly editing esports content. And so you have some kind of conflict either where almost every editor in the esports space either has limited experience with esports or limited experience with editing. So there isn't really the kind of person who either both understands the unique time crunches, who understands the way that the media relationships works with teams, or you have someone who is not really able to understand, I guess, or can't really give you feedback on your esports specific pieces, or you have someone who just kind of loves esports and doesn't really know what they're doing, doesn't have a way to manage the websites, doesn't have a good time frame. What's kind of your experience with esports editors in particular?
So I have not found an editor that was as candid and as harsh with me as I have since my initial journalism program. And I don't know if that's because perspective has shifted since then, my own perspective and my own writing growth, but I've never, there have been a few editors I've had in esports that have been genuinely good, and I felt like they cared about making me a better writer. I know it's really weird because not everyone in esports who is a writer is interested in the craft of writing itself, and that's totally fine. You don't have to be. But for someone who is, I personally am, I really want someone to rip me apart, I want someone to be this is bad, here's what you should do, here's how we can make it better. And that's what I personally feel is sometimes missing from esports editing. I don't know if it's because people are afraid to be quote unquote mean, and this is something I run into when I've edited friends' pieces on the side. I'm just okay, so how how candid do you want me to be? Like, how much do you want me to rip into this? Because I don't ever want someone to take something that I move around in their piece or whatever personally. But I guess from my perspective, I don't take it personally, and I just want to be a better writer. And I feel like just because of the lack of experience that a lot of editors might have in editing if they come from the esports side, or then if you are like, esports is also a really weird thing, because if you're an esports editor, you might know more about Dota and CSGO than you do about League of Legends, but then you're editing someone's League of Legends piece, and obviously it then becomes this really weird conversation where you have to explain why you might have written something some way, or like, I forget what the one word, there was one word I used that's like super common in League that like tilted one of my editors so hard.
I've had an editor make me, in an article, explain what a best of 3 is, because they didn't know. Like, they had edited other types of work, but they'd never encountered, like, best of 3 as an expression. Even though everyone who's going to be consuming, like, the type of esports content I do would know generally what a best of 3 is, the editor didn't, so I had to define it in the piece, for example. Like, this is an example that I will bring up quite a bit, is that just the disconnect between some of the editors in the esports scene and esports itself is very interesting.
I feel like I haven't, except for a few rare occasions, been able to find an editor who is willing to like really, really take a look at my work, like completely rip it apart and really make it better. And I don't know if that's because, and I hate to say this, like, content quality and actually making money off of esports aren't necessarily two things that go hand in hand. And, you know, this is kind of inevitable to bring up when we talk about esports journalism.
Yeah, I mean, the things that people say they want aren't necessarily what they have statistically done the best, right? People who say they want in-depth analysis of certain things are, like, this is a very famous Thorin topics that people say they want in-depth analysis and seriousness, but they really just want the punchy one-liners. They want the players saying something about Korean players saying something about thinking about going to NA, like this sorts of, and then people have done really great, involved, detailed, well handcrafted, like I think you're probably one of the best interview feature writers in the scene, if not the best. I think you're the best, but whatever. The point is that people have done very good interview feature writing, good content, but that's never ever going to get as many views as a Q&A style format interview. Mm-hmm. Even though you might have the exact same words, even though your piece actually might provide more context and more details of what the player was doing or what the player was talking about at the time, give you like an image of the scene or additional information that you won't get from Q&A text, like 9 times out of 10, the Q&A interview will almost always do better of the same interview content. So I think that that's a very interesting aspect of it. I think that this is a problem in general, though, just also print media being very undervalued. I think this is do you feel like this is an esports particular problem, or do you think it's exaggerated in esports at all?
I think it's every journalism problem.
Okay.
I think that, you can see this in all aspects of journalism. I think, so if we're going to stick to the comparison with traditional sports journalism, I think you see certain things that have taken place across a lot of traditional outlets where they've either trimmed down like word count, or they've, gone to like really quick highlight videos, and that kind of thing, because that is the stuff that immediately gets more views. And if people are wondering why this matters, no one has figured out how to make money off of online writing. And this is a whole other topic in and of itself, but it kind of touches on why writing in esports is so challenging, and why I'm not here to be like everyone sucks and editors suck. Like that's actually not the point. The point is that if you're under like that sort of time crunch and you're just trying to pump out as much content as possible, because the only way to make money off of writing is to somehow get advertisers involved, That's also why you see like a ton of videos popping up on a lot of traditional sports sites as well. You know, not every site can be like if you are a site that is just writing long form feature pieces at a consistently high level, and I can think of a few that aren't, I'm not even talking about esports, I'm just talking about journalism and culture and stuff like that. It's just so hard to make money off of it. So I totally understand where this is coming from. I think the thing that is unique to esports specifically, though, is that or League of Legends esports, I should say, is that it came up at the exact same time that like Reddit really started to matter, in terms of trying to aggregate. It basically acts as its own aggregate, right, for articles. That's the initial purpose of Reddit. And so one thing that's unique to esports is that it came up at the same time that Reddit started to really matter in terms of driving traffic towards various sites. So that is something that is definitely unique to League of Legends, and it's interesting to study the evolution of Reddit as an aggregator and how that has affected League of Legends esports journalism, because I think it's actually impossible to separate the two by virtue of how they both kind of rose at the same time and grew with each other. And I know so many people are like have tried to find ways to get around using Reddit as an aggregate, or like for me personally, I don't even really visit the subreddit anymore, because I'm like too afraid to ever be seen as like someone who's voting their own stuff or commenting or anything like that. So it's a very weird, like unhealthy marriage that no one has figured out how to wrap their head around. And I think that is also affecting esports journalism in general, and as such is kind of a microcosm for what's going on in journalism as a whole, where no one's really figured out how to make money since the internet and social media really like have been at the forefront of driving traffic to things.
I also don't want to go heavily into this because I feel like the esports salon episode on monetization of esports content was pretty thorough in a lot of the topics that I bring up. But I think that that's definitely something we're talking about, is that just how just generally like the quality and the polished piece is both not going to feed, like I've been working on this TSM historical project for weeks at this point, but I'm not going to get that much from it when it comes out for the amount of time that goes into it. And just the general, like the pay available, the general time crunch, the people involved both on the writing side and the editing side, just it makes it really hard for the type of like content that people say they want to really exist, because also it doesn't really align with what is in demand and what's making money. I also think that something that we haven't talked about as much is that something that's fairly unique to esports that isn't as much in traditional sports is how much teams and Riot, the Riot gaming company in itself, make content, and where they have separate sets of resources from esports publications to make this kind of content, and how people will look at content produced by teams or Riot and say, well, this content is just better quality. Like you have immediate video access to players, you release like weekly documentaries, you have separate sections to build this kind of content who collaborate with each other and they work on one project, and then they have money to sort of pay for this project, as opposed to like me working on one project for a very long amount of time and getting paid 100 for it or something like this. Then it's a lot more easy for them to make these kinds of high production value content versus like third-party individuals. So the question then becomes like, why even bother consuming third-party content to an extent? And obviously like there have been outlets like Blitz Esports who have been able to make kind of nicer things, but again, we're not sure like even what Blitz Esports monetization program is like or anything like this, or how their profit structure is working. So, I mean, I hope Blitz succeeds, but it's also like the question, because of the climate always in the back of your mind, is like, how long can they sustain this type of thing? Because we aren't really sure where the money is coming from. So, what are your thoughts on that aspect?
I think so. It's pretty interesting to me that it's fallen on the teams themselves to do a lot of content, because I think so. Another thing that goes hand in hand with this, that I guess I'll like jump ahead to a bit, is that a lot of the writers in the space, or three of them, two of them are here, and one of them is Fionn, who are more well known in the scene, all came from Riot's LoL esports program, and actually a lot more people than you probably realize came from them doing their own content about League of Legends in and of itself. And the thing that's not applicable is that we obviously didn't get, like, or as a freelancer, I did not get any sort of backstage access or anything like that. I hadn't even attended an event yet at the time I was writing for them. That was the beginning of teams then looking at it and saying, like, maybe we can just do content around our own team, or we'll do exclusive content with our own players because, hey, they're right here. Team Liquid had their documentary series. TSM has theirs. Cloud9 has theirs. Like, nearly every single team now has their own documentary series with a really good staff and production values and stuff like that. So I think another reason why we see a lot of that happening is because you, as a team, want to brand yourself well, right? Like, that's a huge part, and it's something that people really, really should pay attention to going into this season if you're following North America. I'm actually somewhat more curious about China, just because, like, the amount of money that's in the scene. But most people, I'm assuming, are going to be watching North America, and since those are the two regions that are franchising first, I think it'll be really interesting to see how teams try to market themselves, because this is where I see a lot of the content itself coming from, is that as a team, you want to try to attract fans. And in League of Legends, it is a player-driven brand first, in my opinion. So, like, a lot, and what all that means is that fans are more likely to follow a specific player than they are a team, outside of a few exceptions. And maybe that'll change. And I think one of the reasons how it could change is because teams seem very committed to putting out content about their own teams. And it's not necessarily like a battle between third-party media and teams. I think both have, like, different goals in mind, where third-party media are trying to write about different stories and stuff like that from their own perspective, where teams are trying to do it from a more, like, this is our team, we are, TSM, and these are our players, and this is how we're going to sell them to you. But I do think that sometimes third party can find it a little bit more difficult to get access because of that.
I do think,
because teams would definitely rather, like, spend more time branding themselves as entities as much as they can.
I do think one part of it that you didn't touch on that is very obvious is that we talked about the types of esports journalists who are in the space, who are hobbyists, who kind of get into it as a one-off, and then why would I do an interview with someone who has 200 Twitter followers when I can put TSM Legends on my Twitter with millions of followers, right? And get so much more exposure that way. Like, I think a lot of teams have the mentality that I am doing this journalist a favor by giving them this interview. It's not like when journalism was initially developing, where your newspaper is going to have so much more exposure and be able to get, like, more information out to people than if you are standing on a soapbox in a back alley talking about how great your team is, right? So I think it's like with the social media being the way it is, with people being much more interested in having loyalty to teams than necessarily esports publications or journalists, and people seeing like the general mentality that if I'm doing an interview with Kelsey, I'm helping Kelsey out, right? So, for example, since I do have an okay following, and so it's like, thank you very much for supporting. I appreciate it. Okay, sorry, that was... I am obviously find it much easier to get interviews and do like much more extensive content with teams that and players who maybe have like 8,000 followers or 500 followers or European players.
Hey, I mean, I cover Brazil, and I love interviewing all of my Brazilian players.
That's also an issue, because it's really difficult to convince an organization that has its own reach, that has enough money and has enough resources to be able to produce their own content and brand themselves, that it's worthwhile to do third-party media at all. It's really difficult, because if they're coming to it from a perspective of, well, we're doing you a favor, then it's really hard to get on board. So you have to kind of emphasize the value of third-party media to even sort of get player access. And I think sometimes fans don't necessarily even see the value of third-party media. So at that point, what are you trying to tell the teams, right? How are you going to sell yourself in a way?
Yeah.
So, and it's like a lot of times they'll say, well, I'll agree to this if I can control the message in this way. But if they're going to do that, then they really should just create their own content, because the value of third-party media, I think, is the outside perspective, and it is showing like some of the things that aren't exactly what the team wants you to see. And that, believe it or not, can be really valuable to the teams themselves. Because if you have someone who's saying, well, this team fucked up in this way, or this was a bad situation, then you have like much more informed criticism. You have much more, like, people aren't necessarily saying Bjergsen is a piece of shit. If you have someone who's able to have an interview with someone else on the team afterwards, and then like add their own commentary and their own context to the situation and sort of break down what happened, then you aren't necessarily you're in theory media is supposed to give you an extra voice that you can trust, right? So you're not taking what the team is saying or what Riot is saying at face value. This is supposed to be like part of the function of media, whether it's game commentary, whether it's investigative reporting, you're supposed to have someone who is supposed to be unbiased and can give a clear picture and can build a reputation. And obviously this hasn't always been the case with like journalism in general, because a lot of times that was like, you trust the publication. But because of the way that esports journalism is and the fluctuation of publications coming in and out, it's really much more about the relationship of the journalist with the fans and the teams than it is the publication.
An addendum to that, just really quickly, is I think one other thing that third-party media can do, or maybe it's just because this is my own personal expertise, is you can basically take someone to an event from a broader perspective and share that experience with people, which I actually think is really invaluable. And it's something that obviously, like, it's a lot different than a behind the scenes access with like one specific team, but like being able to bring someone to an event like the LCK finals. I'm only bringing this up because I was there and this is what I tried to do. I'm not sure if I succeeded or failed. I did like those pieces I wrote though. So, but I think that's another thing that a third party perspective can really be interesting, is where you can maybe interview both teams or talk to both sides or provide like a more like whole experience that takes people to that event if they weren't able to go, or takes people to like a specific moment in a game where they might not have seen like different facets or angles of it. So I think that's another value that third-party media can provide.
And that's why even going through all of the stuff we went through and levying criticism against teams, levying criticism against Riot, levying criticism against editors, I think the biggest thing that has to happen for esports media to be successful is really on the journalist, and really on building yourself. And it's really difficult, but you have to like be willing to put in the time and the work to put forth this consistent stream of content, to have an individualized voice almost, that people understand what they're going to you for. Like Emily will provide you with an experience of being there, or with details that you wouldn't get yourself. Tyler will provide you with like some interesting storylines that the teams haven't thought of themselves, or an interesting perspective like on that a player had during a game. Travis will be able to give you like a personable relationship where you feel like you know the player better, like you have a good relationship, a good rapport with that guy, and like you almost feel like watching a Travis Gafford interview, you almost feel like you're friends with Doublelift, right? Like this is kind of the situation that you set up. But and then of course like even Reginald is starting to see the value of having Thorin do interviews, and I would say that TSM is one of the biggest why would we bother with third-party media organizations in esports, right? And there is definitely value there, but I think why esports journalism becomes so hard is because it comes down to the individual reporter and being able to develop yourself in a way. So I think that that's why I get kind of tilted when so many people in media levy huge criticisms against teams or players, when maybe it's unfair that it's like this in esports, but you have to keep in mind that this is a unique industry and your role is also unique as a result.